September 12th, 1683. The sun rose over Vienna to reveal a sight that would decide the fate of Europe. The cannon had been thundering for months, hollowing out stone and hope alike. 200,000 Ottoman soldiers stood at the gates of the Habsburg capital, their guns finally silent after 60 days of relentless bombardment that had reduced sections of the city walls to rubble and ash. Inside those crumbling fortifications, 11,000 exhausted defenders prepared for what they believed would be their final day. They had no food, no ammunition, no reason to believe rescue would come. But on the hills to the northwest, something was stirring. Something the Sultan's armies had not anticipated. Something they couldn't see but would soon feel with devastating clarity. The largest relief force ever assembled in Christian Europe was about to descend upon them like a thunderstorm. 65,000 men. Cavalry from across the continent. Infantry hardened by decades of war. Artillery positioned on high ground with perfect firing angles. And hidden among them, held in reserve for the precise moment when their impact would be absolute, was the weapon that would end the siege in an afternoon. Not the biggest gun. Not the largest army. Not superior numbers or better supplies. The Polish winged hussars. 3,000 armored cavalrymen mounted on horses bred for one purpose: shock and devastation. A weapon the Ottomans barely registered until it struck. A force that would arrive, as if from nowhere, and unmake everything the Sultan had built. What happened next would end Ottoman expansion into Europe forever and shift the balance of world power for centuries to come. This is the story of that charge, of that weapon, of that September afternoon when the fate of Europe was decided not by siege warfare or artillery bombardment, but by 3,000 men in winged armor descending a hill at full gallop. I want you to picture Vienna in the grey, long dawn of that day. 200,000 men crouched in camps around the city, a dark ring of tents and standards. Powder smoke and the odor of men and animals hung in the air. For months, the Ottoman bombardment had been relentless. Massive bombards, the heavy siege guns of the age, had pounded the walls until masonry lay in heaps. Inside, perhaps 11,000 souls stood cramped behind ruined defenses. Soldiers, citizens, refugees, even children. Food ran low. Disease brewed in cellars. The governor, Count Ernst Rüdiger von Starhemberg, had done what a desperate commander could. Organized sorties, bet on countermines, improvised barricades, and stretched every ounce of will and resource to hold the gates. Yet the sense was common to all who were there. Vienna's lights might be extinguished before relief arrived. If this kind of deep dive into turning points in military history is what you like, subscribe and stick around for more. There's a playlist with tactical breakdowns and source notes you can check in the pinned description. To make sense of why a cavalry charge could matter so decisively, we have to step back and see the scene in 3 dimensions. The strategic map that brought the Ottoman army to Vienna, the brutal engineering of early modern siegecraft, and the political scramble that produced a ragged coalition determined to relieve the city. Only then can the hussars' charge be understood not as romantic theatrics, but as the final, kinetic expression of a dozen decisions and mistakes that met in a single ridge above the Viennese suburbs. By 1683, the Ottoman state was not the sprawling, invincible machine of older myth, but it remained a formidable imperial power across the eastern Mediterranean, the Balkans, and Anatolia. Its armies were professional, its logistics seasoned from decades of campaigning, and its elite infantry, the Janissaries, had a reputation for fierce discipline and firepower. The Ottoman army that laid siege to Vienna was a mixed force. Massive artillery for battering walls, Janissary riflemen and musketeers to garrison trenches and storm breaches, and Sipahi cavalry for pursuit and open-field fighting. Kara Mustafa Pasha, the Grand Vizier and the operations commander, had clear aims. Vienna was not merely a city, it was a gateway. Control of Vienna would open the heart of Habsburg Europe, present a political triumph to the Sublime Porte, and alter the balance between east and west. Ottoman siegecraft in the late 17th century was an industrialized art. To reduce a fortress meant more than shelling. It meant mining under walls, tunneling to bring explosives beneath bastions, and coordinating shock teams to exploit breaches. Siege artillery had grown heavier in the previous century, with mortars and large-caliber bombards capable of sending stones that dented defensive networks built over generations. Janissaries could hold the approaches to breaches, while sappers undermined bastions, and countermines sought to intercept them. The Ottomans brought these methods to Vienna with full intent. Their rings of trenches, gabions, and batteries were methodical. They could assault, or wait for the mine to spring and the bastion to fall. Either way, the math favored the besiegers. Inside the city, the defenders improvised. Vienna's fortifications were of the trace Italian type, angular bastions designed to deflect cannon shot and permit overlapping fields of fire. But where trace works best is with ample men to man the curtain and with a functional supply network to rotate defenders. Vienna had neither at full strength. Starhemberg's measures read like a manual of desperation. Countermines dug deeper into the earth to intercept enemy tunnels, sorties launched at night to disrupt sappers, and cordons of defenders slinging makeshift earthworks where stone had crumbled. A contemporary account, recorded by someone who survived the months of bombardment, notes the grinding exhaustion inside the city. The daily chore of hauling sandbags, the smell of baked bread turned bitter, children sleeping in cellars that smelled of smoke and wet wool. Starhemberg himself was stern and resolute, a soldier who refused to surrender while even a single wall stood. That resilience mattered. It bought time. Time, in this case, was the currency of coalition politics. Relief did not appear out of thin air. It was the product of a chaotic diplomatic scramble across Central Europe. Emperor Leopold I had fled to avoid capture by an advancing army, leaving the defense to his lieutenants. Requests for aid went to courts in the Holy Roman Empire and to the Polish king, Jan III Sobieski. The idea of a combined Christian force was familiar to all Europeans. War had taught states to unite against a common danger when survival itself was at stake. But assembling such an army in 1683 was not like flipping a switch. It required agreements, the promise of pay, and the delicate choreography of sovereign pride and rival ambitions. Charles V, Duke of Lorraine, accepted the command of the imperial forces. Sobieski, a veteran field commander and a king every bit as proud as he was pragmatic, agreed to lead the Polish contingent. What emerged was a coalition. Imperial troops, Bavarians, Saxons, some German principalities contingents, and the powerful Polish crown forces, including the winged hussars, a cavalry arm that combined heavy armor, long lances, and a reputation for breaking formations. Moving these forces toward Vienna was an operational headache. The terrain around the city is not open plain, but a patchwork of woods, ridges, and low hills, ground that hides movement and complicates supply. The chosen approach exploited the Vienna woods, a belt of forests northwest of the city that could conceal columns from Ottoman scouts and artillery observers. It was a double-edged choice. Move through the woods, and one avoided the direct gaze of Ottoman batteries. Move through the woods, and progress slowed. Columns stretched, and how to achieve synchronized contact became uncertain. Sobieski and his lieutenants judged the risk worth taking. Surprise, they believed, would offset the delay. Kara Mustafa, for his part, made decisions that would prove costly. He believed he had Vienna largely contained and concentrated siege assets where gunfire and mining would win the day. In his operational deployment, he divided his field forces between those intent on battering the walls and those posted to guard the approaches. From a command perspective, the gamble was understandable. You must manage siege works while still protecting your flanks. Yet the division of forces created vulnerability. When the relief army approached through the woods, and moved into position, the Ottoman forces found themselves asked to do two things at once: continue the siege and pivot to meet a field army they had not fully arrayed to fight. The week leading up to September 12th unfolded like a tightened spring. Intermittent skirmishing tested skirmish lines. Artillery exchanges grew in volume. On the morning of the 12th, a hush seemed to grip the field, the kind that presages sudden violence. The relief army had forced its way to the outskirts, and within Vienna the defenders, bruised, hollow-eyed, and fiercely determined, launched a sortie. Starhemberg had been waiting for this chance for months. If the garrison could mount a sudden attack from within the city, even a small one, it could force the Ottomans to split attention and manpower, perhaps enough to reduce the defenders' weakest flank to ruin. The sortie was not meant to win on its own. It was meant to cut to Harry, to send a message that Vienna was still a fighting city. What followed was a choreography of small decisions that built to catastrophe for the Ottomans. The city sortie surged out along the walls, hitting siege works and for a time threatening to overrun forward batteries. The Ottomans countered. Janissary detachments pulled inwards, and Sipahi squadrons moved to chase the garrison's troops. On the relief army side, the imperial centre engaged the Ottomans' front in a grinding exchange. It was bloody and inconclusive. These frontal engagements were not intended to break the enemy. Rather, they were the holding actions, the central friction that would keep enemy attention focused where the Poles wanted it to be. All the while, Sobieski watched. His decision to commit the hussars could not be made lightly. Shock cavalry operates under narrow constraints. It requires ground that permits charge in mass. It requires momentum. It requires an enemy whose formation or morale already teeters. A cavalry charge that hits solid, fresh, well-ordered infantry with sufficient firepower and stakes anchored will fail as spectacularly as any flawed assault. The hussars could not simply be thrown in to wishful effect. Timing, therefore, was everything. We tend to think of the winged hussars in dramatic costume, the leather wings attached to their backs or saddles, the long lances gleaming like stacked spears. But for their contemporaries they were more than an aesthetic. These were armoured riders, sometimes wearing partial plate and mail, backed by decades of battlefield experience in shock tactics. Their lances could be upwards of 5 to 7 meters long in some accounts, instruments designed to strike first and hard, to break the lines of enemy cavalry, to smash into a formation and unbalance it before small arms could be effectively brought to bear. The wings themselves, whether attached to the rider, the saddle, or to frames, added a psychological dimension. They rustled and cast a silhouette that could seem larger, more monstrous, and produce an unexpected whoosh or clatter as 20, 30, or hundreds of horses thundered by in unison. Sound and sight matter in combat. The human brain under stress is quick to accept exaggerated threats. A mass of charging horsemen could, in a few seconds, translate into panic among troops already stretched thin by fatigue and the sheer length of the day. But again, the hussar charge would have been nothing without the conditions that made it possible. The sortie from Vienna had already made the Ottomans reassign men to rearward positions. The imperial centre was locked in brutal combat. Ottoman commanders had to decide where to allocate reserves. Perhaps more crucially, many Ottoman units had been fighting siege operations under the hot sun for weeks, and their discipline and energy were fraying. Contemporary reports, the kinds of fragments we rely on cautiously, note the ragged movements of some Ottoman cavalry, the gaps that appeared between formations, the frictions that result when a chain of command stretches beyond clear sight and sound. Every small friction reduced the cohesion that a shock cavalry needed to meet. The relief force's movement through the Vienna woods was itself a test of discipline. Columns crept along tracks barely wide enough for supply wagons. Horses bowed foraging in the shade. The commanders communicated by courier as the sun climbed. Sobieski, who combined the temperament of a courtier with the mind of a soldier, had to coordinate not only the Polish lancers, but also the infantry and the several allied detachments under Charles of Lorraine and other imperial leaders. He did this knowing that if he committed too early, the hussars might shatter against prepared lines. If he waited too late, the chance to exploit the sortie would dissipate. Kara Mustafa's positioning increased the hazard. By holding strong around the city, with a bulk of his force, and leaving fewer troops on the left flank where the woods met open ground, he created an exploitable asymmetry. Some of his detachments, tasked with watching the relief columns, were posted too far forward, within reach of counterattacks but isolated. Others were drawn thin by the need to garrison trenches and batteries nearest the breaches. The Grand Vizier had not expected a full-scale relief army to arrive intact and coordinated. He expected attrition. Empires often misjudge the human variable. Stubbornness, resilience, and the capacity to unite against a perceived existential threat. His miscalculation was not one decision that night. It was a pattern of assumptions repeated across days. At midday, the battlefield congealed into something that looked like a classical visual of attrition. Smoke drifting over broken earth, columns of men closing and withdrawing, the dull shine of metal. The Polish cavalry started to form, not as a single array, but in brigades marshaled in the covering woods, their banners signaling, lances held vertical, horses packed in depth. Sound traveled oddly through the trees, a drum here, a trumpet there. When a scout returned with the report that the appointment of the moment had come, that the sortie had struck, that Ottoman attention had indeed been split, Sobieski allowed the final act to begin. Yet even then the hussars did not simply gallop forth in an unthinking explosion. They crept into position, massing on a ridge that looked down upon the Ottoman left. The space ahead was a short descent to the enemy arrays, not a plain, but enough to allow gravity and speed to add to the momentum. Momentum for shock cavalry is a force multiplier. A mounted lance delivered at full speed imparts kinetic energy far beyond the single length of wood and steel. It acts like a battering ram formed of flesh and iron. But to receive all that force, the ground must not be broken by ravines or sudden ditches. Horses must have footing. The formation must hold, ranks shoulder to shoulder, lances upright, eyes forward. There are small details that make history feel close in that suspended moment. I imagine riders checking straps and girths, a groom giving a last pat to a horse, a commander scanning the horizon for any sign that the enemy might pivot. The hussars' wings rustle and catch the afternoon light. Their lances form a forest of polished shafts. The air tastes like cordite, sweat, and old leather. From the Ottoman side, men in turbans and sleeved coats squinted into the distance, trying to determine whether the thunder they heard beyond the woods was the start of a massed attack. Some officers moved along the lines, orders were passed under tension. But the chain between the grand camps and the front was frayed by weeks of besieging labor and constant exchanges. And that fraying would show in the next hours. Military history is littered with almosts. A planned maneuver that comes a minute too late, a message intercepted, a unit that holds a touch longer and changes the outcome of an entire campaign. In the shadow of Vienna's walls, the almosts accumulated into a decisive confluence. The garrison sortie had not only pressured Ottoman siege works, it had forced a reallocation of elite troops. The central assaults by imperial forces had occupied the Ottomans' attention and resources. The left flank, thinner, tired, and now facing the prospect of an enfilading blow, had to scramble reserves from the nearby fieldworks. Sobieski's decision, therefore, was not an act of religious bravado or cinematic risk-taking. It was a calculation informed by reconnaissance, by an eye for the morale of both friend and foe, and by the grim arithmetic of constraint. He read a battlefield where a high-speed impact delivered at the point of maximum enemy disarray could shatter formations that otherwise would have held. The hussars would not win the day alone, but if they struck at the right place at the right time, they could create the breach in the Ottoman tactical fabric, that the artillery and the sortie had not. As the Polish squadrons rolled forward into the final prelude, the sequence of the campaign's earlier choices condensed into a few fragile facts. Ottoman capabilities to feed and rotate troops had been stretched. Their commander had chosen to divide his force to maintain the siege. Vienna's defenders had found the nerve for a sortie that forced several replies, and the relief army had chosen a concealed approach that preserved surprise. Each by itself might have produced only an incremental effect. Together, they readied a collapse. The hussars' first ranks leaned forward. Their horses, trained for the shock, held in check for a final instant. The line formed like tidewater held back by a sandbar. An immense, stored energy. Below them, the Ottoman left made its last adjustments, musket bands tightening, cavalry making their own preparations, and artillery crews trying to reorient guns. No artillery could yet fire accurately into the woods without endangering their own troops. Commanders exchanged glances with the grim economy of men who know that if they fail, the cost will be measured in lives. The moment before release is a quiet the mind recognizes. Months of build-up, tens of thousands of men, and the fate of a city press upon a few heartbeats. Every leader there felt it, and every soldier would remember it. For the Ottomans, there was weariness and exhaustion. For the Viennese, a last strand of hope. For the Poles, a resolve as luminous as the white metal on their helmets. Then, as the sun tilted and the day leaned, orders went out. Ranks tightened, horses strained at the reins. The edges of the woods parted. At that point, the stage was set. All the threads, the siege's attrition, the sortie's disruption, the relief army's positioning, and the Grand Vizier's misallocation of forces, converged to create the cleft into which the hussars would drive. What followed next would be the literal thunderbolt the army of the Sultan had not accounted for. A concentrated mass of shock cavalry, armored and disciplined, surging down a slope with lances leveled toward the Ottoman left. But the charge itself, its sound, its impact, the way lances met men and guns, belongs to the next act. For now, the air held the taste of imminent violence. The hussars leaned forward. The Ottomans braced. Vienna, empty of leisure, held its breath. The forest breathed for a final instant, and then everything broke loose. When the hussars gave the signal, it was no cinematic burst of trumpets alone. It was the release of months of stored violence. Hooves struck leaf-strewn earth, and then found the firmer ground of the slope. Lances glinted, a discipline of points held like the teeth of a saw. The line that had been coiled in the Vienna woods collapsed forward as a single organism. Men, horses, and the long wooden shafts that would decide the hour. The sound was not the tidy drum roll of ceremony, but a low, rising thunder, the kind that presses against your chest. For those who had watched in the tents, the noise might have been mistaken for an artillery salvo, until the shape of it came into focus. Hundreds, then thousands of mounted figures pouring from the tree line, their wings catching and scattering light like the flash off a moving wall. The charge struck the Ottoman left where it was most vulnerable. Remember the geometry. The slope gave the hussars gravity and acceleration. The ordinary ground ahead was neither cratered nor oblique enough to disrupt momentum. The Ottoman units there were stretched thin by weeks of siege labor and by the demands of guarding a ring of batteries and trenches. Those troops had been forced, an hour earlier, to shift inward to answer the sortie and to guard against an imperial center that would not yield. The hussars found, in short, a seam. Impact is a word often used loosely, but in that first collision, it was literal and catastrophic. Lances met horse and man, not in the clean, cinematic way film sometimes suggests, but with a sickening businesslike force. A long lance delivered at full gallop is a concentrated application of kinetic energy. It unhorses rather than stabs gracefully, and the line effect matters as much as the single strike. The first rank drove into the Ottoman squadrons, their point-blank momentum snapping stirrups, wounding horses, and bending the defensive posture of formations designed to receive lighter cavalry. Behind the shock, other Polish brigades followed, their lances finding gaps, their horses trampling broken men and stray standards. Where a formation held together, the shot and pike of janissary detachments could still be lethal. Where it split or hesitated, panic spread like flame. Panic, on a field of battle, is contagious. Once pockets of disorder spread, the carefully worked structure of a defensive line can unravel in minutes. Ottoman cavalry, already tested by skirmishes and rotations, pulled back against the pressure. Artillery crews found their avenues of fire compromised as gunners dropped or fled. Guns that had spent months battering Vienna's walls were now dangerously close to being turned or abandoned. In some positions, crews hastily spiked pieces to deny them to attackers. In others, cannoneers tried to fight while men in front of them were trampled. Contemporary observers, whose fragments survive in letters and memoirs, saw the spectacle as a collapse of morale as much as one of tactical failure. The image of standards falling, men throwing themselves from trenches, and commanders trying to rally units that could not be reformed under the cascading weight of the Polish horse. This is where the hidden quality matters. The hussars were not a secret. They were known across courts in Europe and the Ottoman Empire alike. What made them hidden that day was timing and place. Hidden by the woods, hidden by the sortie that drew attention inward, hidden by the exhausted state of the units they struck. History rarely delivers simple, solitary causes. What we can say with confidence is that their charge was the decisive catalyst, the shock that converted cumulative disadvantages into rout. The rout widened quickly. Where one flank broke, neighboring units found their lines exposed to enfilade fire or direct cavalry pressure. Janissary detachments, usually the backbone in fights near breaches, were pulled away to cover threatened batteries, or were themselves forced to fight in compromised positions. The imperial center, sensing opportunity, increased the pressure. How many thousands were involved across the front is debated by historians, but the character of the fighting changed from localized contest to disordered flight. Ottoman artillery, once a terror to Viennese walls, became a liability when crews abandoned pieces and horses stampeded through camps. Horses had been the engines of the attack earlier in the siege. Now they became instruments of catastrophe as columns of withdrawn men collided with supply trains. The pursuit that followed was merciless, but not instantaneous. Pitched fighting along the line continued for hours. Rearguard actions, desperate attempts to save standards and treasure, skirmishes over wagons and supply horses. The relief army did not instantly annihilate the Ottoman force. It transformed it from a coherent besieging army into a retreating mass. Retreat on a large scale in the 17th century is as dangerous as defeat on the spot. Columns get clogged, sick and wounded are left behind, and the baggage train is a target that can neither fight nor swiftly withdraw. Allied cavalry and infantry pressed the withdrawal, and nightfall would come to mean not rest, but the end of organized resistance on that plain. What followed in the immediate hours and days was a grim tally. Contemporary and later estimates of losses vary widely. Some contemporary observers exaggerated both for propaganda and to stagger the imagination, so it's important to treat numbers cautiously. Most modern historians place Ottoman losses in the engagement and the immediate aftermath in the thousands. Conservative modern estimates suggest that Ottoman casualties, killed, wounded, and those captured or missing during the rout, likely numbered in the low tens of thousands when the whole action and subsequent pursuit are considered. Allied casualties were significantly lower, but not negligible. Several thousand men, including Poles, Germans, and other contingents, were killed or wounded in the fighting that freed the city. Beyond these numbers, the human toll included civilians caught in the crossfire, Townspeople who had endured months of siege now tending to the city's wounded and burying the dead in hurried, often improvised graves. Those individual losses are the human cost of what later political narratives would call a deliverance. The fate of Kara Mustafa crystallizes what happens to commanders who gamble and lose. The Grand Vizier had commanded the siege with energy and ruthlessness. He had invested prestige and the port's expectations in the operation. When defeat occurred, that investment translated into personal peril. He fled the field. There is no heroic end at the place of his own choosing, but the Ottoman state was unforgiving. By late 1683, he would be executed by order of the Sultan, held responsible for the failure. That execution was itself a political act. The empire needed a scapegoat as much as it needed to signal stern accountability. The manner and timing, carried out months later in Belgrade, was consistent with how early modern empires managed both justice and image. The victory at Vienna did not immediately destroy the Ottoman Empire. To suggest as much would be to flatten a complex arc into a single melodramatic moment. Yet the siege's failure marked a real turning point. It punctured the aura of Ottoman invincibility that had guided diplomacy and fear for over a century. The relief catalyzed a larger reaction across Central Europe, a prolonged Great Turkish War that would officially run until the Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699. Over that decade and more, the Habsburgs and their allies seized territory in Hungary and Transylvania, and the Ottoman frontier contracted. The empire did not collapse in 1683, but its momentum was checked. The political and military balance shifted in ways that had long-term consequences for the shape of southeastern Europe. We should be careful about teleology. The 1683 battle did not single-handedly reconfigure early modern geopolitics in one afternoon. It did, however, create a credible and emboldened coalition that would press the Ottomans on multiple fronts. It altered perception as much as it altered maps. Diplomats now argued from a different baseline, an Ottoman threat that could be defeated on European soil, and a Habsburg axis that could mount successful offensive operations.
The psychological consequences, both among European courts and within Ottoman circles, were profound. There are stories that have spun out of that battlefield into popular legend. One of the better known is culinary, the croissant. For decades, a narrative circulated in cafes and tour guides that Viennese bakers invented the croissant to celebrate the defeat of the Ottomans, shaping the pastry into a crescent in mockery of the Turkish symbol.
Another is the coffee legend. That Vienna's first taste of Ottoman coffee came via abandoned Ottoman camps, and that the city adopted coffee culture almost overnight. Both stories are attractive and image-rich. They are also historically dubious when treated as straightforward fact. The croissant's origin is tangled in centuries of culinary exchange, and more likely owes its final form to later French pastry tradition. Claims that it was baked specifically on the morning after the siege should be treated as popular legend. The coffee story has more plausible roots. Coffee was spreading through Europe at the time, and was associated with Ottoman practices. But the neat image of Viennese citizens scooping up sacks from a deserted tent city and founding a coffeehouse culture the next day is romantically simple. These are the kinds of tales history often accumulates because they are memorable. They tell us something about how societies retell victory, how myth and fact mix in the public memory. But they are not substitutes for the tactical and diplomatic realities. Those realities include the ways the battle influenced military thought. Shock cavalry, like the winged hussars, had their moment of spectacular success at Vienna. But that moment did not freeze them as an eternally dominant arm. In the decades that followed, the increasing effectiveness of supported infantry volley fire, the professionalization and numerical expansion of musketeer forces, and innovations in fortification and field artillery reduced the occasions where pure cavalry shock could decide battles on its own. The hussars themselves adapted. Polish military practice evolved, as did that of other European powers. and heavy cavalry's role was increasingly integrated into combined arms approaches. The lesson is not that cavalry became useless overnight. Rather, the Vienna charge was an emphatic reminder that tactical shock, when properly timed and supported, remained capable of dramatic effect even in an age increasingly defined by gunpowder. Another enduring lesson is the primacy of coordination and timing. The hussars' impact was not inevitable, it was orchestrated. The garrison's sortie, the stubborn pressure of imperial infantry in the center, the choice to approach via concealment, and the Ottoman command's division of force all came together. That confluence is a case study in how tactical opportunities emerge from operational and strategic decisions. Surprise without concentration is wasted. Concentration without surprise can be blunted. The victory at Vienna exemplifies the three-dimensional nature of military decision-making: political will and coalition building, practical logistics of moving and feeding armies, and the ephemeral human factors of morale, fatigue, and leadership. We should also consider the human dimension beyond maneuvers and numbers. The city of Vienna, for its ordinary inhabitants, had been a place of siege for months. Bread rationing, the constant proximity of death, the smell of smoke and unwashed bodies in cellars where entire families slept, the care of the wounded in any available hall or chapel. After the relief, the jubilant imagery of parades and Thanksgiving services sat beside the more prosaic and sorrowful duties of burying the dead, nursing the wounded, and salvaging what remained from smashed homes and looted stores. On the Ottoman side, camps that had been organized for investment were sites of shattered tents, abandoned treasure that would feed the victors' coffers for a while, and the grief of families who learned slowly and erratically where their sons had fallen. We must not, in recounting tactics and statecraft, efface this human toll. Politically, Vienna's relief strengthened King Jan III Sobieski's prestige. He became a European celebrity, praised by some, envied by others, and his leadership was a reminder of the role of individual command in an era where monarchs still personally led forces. Yet his victory did not translate into lasting dominion for Poland. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth faced its own structural problems that would, over the next century, erode its power. The battle belonged to Europe more broadly than to any single leader. For the Habsburgs, the relief was both a salvation and an acceleration of policy. It allowed Emperor Leopold I and his successors to press offensives that would gradually push the Ottoman border south and east. But victory also created strains. Victors must be paid and supplied, armies must be fed, occupied lands must be administered. The coalition that had come together to relieve Vienna was, like many such alliances in early modern Europe, fragile outside the immediate emergency. That it held together long enough to press the war does not mean it was permanent. In reading the battle's lessons for a modern mind, we should be cautious about making teleological transfers, that is, assuming 19th or 20th century concepts of nation-state mobilization or industrial war apply neatly here. Yet some principles are durable. Surprise, local superiority at the point of decision, unity of command and logistics remain central to successful operations in any era. The Hussars' charge, dramatic as it was, depended on all these. It stands as an object lesson in how a potent local effect can be multiplied by prior preparation and by adversary error. There is an ethical framing to this as well. Battles are often recast into narratives of deliverance and national destiny. Those narratives serve purposes: building cohesion, explaining past suffering, justifying future policy. As historians and as citizens of a present that inherits these stories, we have a duty to hold both the narrative and its shadows in view. The relief of Vienna was a strategic triumph for the Allied forces. It was also a morning after that required the work of rebuilding, reconciliation, and, in many cases, mourning. To celebrate the falchion without acknowledging the cost is to sanitize history. If we return finally to the phrase the title stakes a claim on, the hidden weapon, we should unpack what that means without flattening complexity. The winged hussars were a weapon in the material sense. Heavy lances, trained horses, and a formation geared for impact. They were a weapon in the psychological sense. Their spectacle and timing induced alarm and a collapse of will among some Ottoman units under strain. They were a weapon in the operational sense. Their use was enabled by the garrison's sortie, the imperial centre's pressure, the decision to approach via the woods, and, crucially, the mistakes in Ottoman force distribution. None of these elements alone sufficed to decide the day. Together, they produced a decisive effect. History often gives us these condensing moments. The crash of a single charge, the fall of a bastion, the arrival of a messenger, and asks us to read a wide set of causes into them. That is what we have before us at Vienna. A condensed enactment of logistics, leadership, morale, and chance. The hussars, for a few minutes, converted rhythm into rupture. They were not magic. They were a refined instrument used at the moment when everything else had already aligned to make their strike decisive. In the decades after, the balance in Europe shifted. The Great Turkish War culminated in the Treaty of Karlowitz, where the Ottoman Empire ceded substantial territory in Central Europe. Those adjustments were the result of campaigns fought across years and fronts, not a single pitched encounter. Still, the relief of Vienna stands as the hinge on which a larger sequence turned. It is remembered not because it was the only cause of the Ottoman retreat from Europe, but because it was the dramatic moment when an imperial tide first faltered visibly. When we close the scene in our minds, imagine the aftermath. The ruins around Vienna's breached walls, the stretcher-bearers moving through lanes where relief had just arrived, commanders signing dispatches that would travel slowly to distant courts, the odd quiet pockets where men and animals lay exhausted, the muffled sobs behind shuttered windows. Imagine, too, the shift in how governments, generals, and ordinary people thought about the Ottoman threat. The siege's end did not erase fear, but it altered expectations. That is a kind of change that shapes policy, economies, and ultimately, maps. If you want the full tactical breakdown, unit dispositions, maps of the ridge and the Vienna woods, and the primary source fragments historians rely on, check the pinned description and the playlist linked there for a deeper dive into 17th century warfare and the Great Turkish War. The charge that broke the siege was not merely a spectacle. It was a concentrated lesson in timing, surprise, and the human dimensions of violence. A reminder that sometimes the decisive factor is not the biggest cannon, but the one moment when a disciplined instrument meets a wounded and misaligned opponent at the precise hour history permits.